Well, Feisgama agus Fáilte, welcome and everybody to this Scottish Land Commission virtual public meeting, which is focusing on Skye, Raasay and West Ross. My name is Megan McInnes. I grew up on a crofting as part of a crofting family in South Skye, and I now live in Applecross, just across the water from you. I am going to chair this meeting this evening. I am one of the appointed Scottish Land Commissioners. And before we go too much further into this meeting, I'd like to ask my fellow Scottish Land Commission Land Commission representatives to introduce themselves. So, Andrew, would you like to go first?
Thank you very much. So I'm Andrew Thinn. I'm currently the chair of the Scottish Land Commission. I'll do a wee presentation in due course, and then looking forward to a conversation with you after that.
Thanks, Andrew. Lauren, would you like to go next?
Okay, thanks. Good evening. My name is Lauren MacLeod. I'm one of the Land Commissioners, and I'm based in Oban. Prior to being involved with the Commission, I was the chair of Community Land Scotland, which is the representative body for community landowners in Scotland. And I was thinking back, the first actual community land buyout I was involved with was Borv and Anishada on Skye, based back in 1993, which is 30 years ago. So how time flies, but very much to the discussion after the presentation. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Lauren. And Karen, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm Karen Grant, and I'm a good practice advisor with the Scottish Land Commission, working in the good practice team, where we focus on trying to ensure that land use and ownership aligns with the principles of the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement.
Thanks, Karen. And it's great to have all four of you here as part of this evening's discussion and to answer the questions and the discussion points that will come up. I should also say we have our colleague Nikki Nagler from the Land Commission as well, who's helping in the background with some of the admin. So the Scottish Land Commission is the public body in Scotland tasked with driving forward land reform across the country. So since we were established in 2017, it's been a real priority for us to get out and about and meet folk across the country in rural and urban areas. For example, our last meeting like this was in Edinburgh, and next month we'll be holding a similar one in and around Inverness. Before the pandemic, we used to do these meetings in person in community halls and village halls across the country, but we switched during the pandemic to a virtual format. And it actually works incredibly well, particularly in places like Skye, Raasay and West Ross, which is very geographically dispersed, because we find these meetings are a lot more inclusive and enable greater participation than in-person meetings. However, there is a downside, because it stops us doing these meetings online, means that we're not able to have the in-person chat over a coffee and tea and a biscuit afterwards. So if any of you want to follow up this meeting by getting in contact with us to discuss a specific issue, then please do use the email address that will be provided in the chat later on as part of the presentation if you have any follow-up questions. So we're looking at a period of significant change when it comes to Scotland's land. We're seeing rapid changes in Scotland's rural land market. We're seeing competing demands for land increasing, which is having a significant impact on local communities. For example, when communities are interested in purchasing a piece of land for community ownership and development, but also in terms of the provision of affordable housing and making sure that land is available for other development opportunities. And this is then impacting on the efforts, for example, of communities across rural and island areas to sustain and deal with problems such as tackling depopulation. But within this period of change, there's also significant opportunities in terms of a new land reform bill that's coming up as well. And in addition to that, the Land Commission itself is facing significant changes. We are developing our new strategic plan for the next 3 years. And we're also, myself and Andrew and one of the other 6 appointed commissioners are going to be finishing our roles before the end of the year, and the government will be appointing 3 new commissioners. So there's a big period of change, and that's why it's so important for us to continue to have these meetings and to hear about what's happening in a particular local area. So the purpose of this meeting is to tell you a bit more about who we are and what we're doing, but most importantly, to hear from you about what you are involved with in terms of land reform, what's exciting you, what's bothering you, and what kind of feedback and suggestions you have in terms of the work that we are doing. So the format of this evening's meeting is that in a minute, I'm going to go through a small amount of housekeeping, and then I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to give a brief presentation before we move on to some questions and answers. I'm going to aim to finish by 8:30. I appreciate it is a glorious meeting. It's a glorious evening. And so it's, I understand that many of you will be wanting to get back out again while you can before it gets too dark. So in terms of housekeeping for this evening, this meeting is being recorded. You're welcome to turn your videos on or keep them off as you'd wish. There was information about privacy in the first slide of that was there when you started, and that information also is available on our website. As I said, following Andrew's presentation, we welcome questions from all of you. Please raise your hand if you want to raise to ask your question in person, or if you're not comfortable doing that, please use the chat box. And please also use the chat box to connect and chat to each other during the discussion. We'd also love to have your feedback, and a survey link will appear in the chat box at the end of the session. So without further ado, Andrew, would you like to give the short presentation? Thank you very much.
Megan, thank you very much indeed, and I will certainly do so. I just have to make sure I can get this machine to actually do what it's meant to do, but I shall keep trying. There we go. Excellent. So the first question, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a very, very rapid gallop through a bit of what we've been doing recently and so on and so forth as a kind of prelude to, as Megan says, a discussion with you via the chat box, via the raise hand, whatever. As your thoughts start to evolve over the next 5 or 10 minutes when I'm talking, if you want to sort of type into the chat comments to the effect of what is it that you would find really useful, please do so, because that will help us and will help Megan to sort of manage the conversation going forward. So I just ask you to do that. I'm only going to talk for 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes. So briefly, what on earth is land reform? I guess if you signed up to this, you must have a view about that. But and certainly most people in Scotland are well aware of the history of land issues in Scotland, the highly concentrated pattern of land ownership. We have the most concentrated pattern of land ownership in Western Europe. Not much more than 400 people own half the country. It's quite extraordinary. And what that does is it creates concentrations of landed power in localities, so that entire localities can be, in effect, under the control of one person who may not be particularly well qualified for that role, and may even have been born into that role. Most people also know that land reform's got something to do with tenants' rights and crofters' rights, particularly in the Highlands. People will know that, and they'll be aware of a whole sequence of legislation around all that sort of stuff. Probably people are beginning to be aware that one of the big new things is the whole business of managing land to capture carbon as we go forward with climate change and trying to move to net zero carbon emissions in this country. And what is being called natural capital is not a term I much like, but it's about carbon capture. It may also be about landowners being paid to make our land more biodiverse through something called biodiversity credits. And how on earth are we going to share that and make sure that the benefit of, you know, if our land, it is our land, let's be clear about this. The rights to that land may be owned by individuals, but it's Scotland's land, it belongs to people of Scotland. So if our land is going to be used for this, how do we make sure that's shared in a sensible, fair way? In urban Scotland, less so in the Highlands, although there's plenty of vacant and derelict stuff in the Highlands too, but certainly in urban Scotland, vacant and derelict land is a huge issue. If you live in West Central Scotland, your life is in almost certainly, if you're not particularly well off and can't afford to live in Milngavie or Bearsden, then your life is probably blighted by the fact that you live a few hundred yards from a vacant and derelict piece of land. So dealing with that has been a big priority for us. Community ownership, well known in the Western Isles, 75% of people in the Western Isles now live on community-owned land, much less so in other parts of Scotland. But excitingly, I think, more and more community ownership and the whole idea that communities can buy things, invest in them, fix them, run them in the way that they want, is extending to all sorts of other things, bridges, pubs, even, as this is just from down the road from where I live, public toilets. So there's lots of interesting stuff here. A new and an old area is the whole idea of actually, you know, does land really need to belong to one person? Could we not have multiple interests in the same piece of land? They do in Norway. Why shouldn't, in other parts of Scandinavia, why shouldn't we do that in Scotland? We did experiment between the wars with the idea of what was called a hutting movement, where people owned huts on land that they didn't own. And it was a kind of shared thing. There'd be a farmer farming round about and a hutting on the land. But it didn't work, mainly because they didn't have proper security of tenure. That's my granny's hut, which, to my great annoyance, was burnt to the ground by the landowner in 1970. Tax, you can't get away from tax in life, and financial support is a big issue too in relation to land. Landowners enjoy, if that's the right word, quite a lot of financial support for various things, and that may be right. I mean, we may be paying for, through our taxes, for food security or more timber or whatever. That may be right. But certainly it's an issue, and it's a land reform issue. Reforming, you know, for example, if you're going to get money to plant trees, should there be conditions attached to that you involve the local community, that you design it in a way that suits the local community, things like that. And tax, land is remarkably little taxed, actually, in Scotland and in the UK in general. And yet over 50% of the nation's wealth is held in land. So that seems an odd thing. And it's even odder when individual landowners tell me that the reason they own land is because it enables them to shelter their wealth from tax. So there's clearly work to be done in there. And I think this is the last of the issues I want to flag in terms of what land reform is about. You can't get away from the fact that Scotland is in a dire place in relation to housing, especially housing for younger families. And my kids, and no doubt, I don't know what age everyone is in this call, but other people's kids just can't get a house. And yet over the last 50 years, the price of building a house has risen broadly in line with inflation. It's not the cost of building a house that has rocketed, it's the cost of the land under the house that has rocketed. So it's a land reform issue, and one that we've worked on. The Land Commission was established quite recently by Parliament. So we are a kind of creature of you know, with cross-party support from it. We're not just a creature of the SNP or anything like that. We're appointed by government, but also by Parliament. Parliament has to agree our appointments to the board, and if it doesn't like us, it can say so. Fortunately, it didn't say so. So we provide advice and we provide recommendations, and I think the best way of putting it is we tell truth to power. Power then decides what to do with that truth. We don't decide what to do with it, but we tell truth to power. It's important that we do, and without fear or favour. We're a national organisation, so we don't have, you know, a team for the Highlands or a team for Skye or a team for Glasgow. We're a national organisation. We're a very small one. We're only about a dozen or just over a dozen staff. And we work in 3-year bites. Every 3 years, we agree a plan for the next 3 years, and we agree it with government and we agree it with Parliament. Because we're not democratically elected, they are. So we need to be working on things that they want us to work on. That's right in a democracy. There's a fundamental concept here, and it was put in place as part of the legislation that created the Land Commission, and that is what they then called the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. But it's a basic principle, and that is, yes, you can own rights. You can own the right to shoot things. You can own the right to grow food. You can own the right to plant trees. You can own the right to fish, whatever. But those are not, they're not free rights. With land rights go responsibilities. You have responsibilities to the rest of the Scottish people and the rest of society if you own land. So it's a very, very important and very, very fundamental concept. And I bang on and on about it. In fact, I saw someone on Twitter saying, as Andrew Thim says, with land rights go responsibilities. Well, I'm sorry, but I will go on saying that because I think it's a really important fundamental principle that Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, has said it loud and clear. Part 1 of the 2016 Act. So this is the strategic plan we're just coming to the end of. I'm going to say a little bit about that, but not too much. So here's just some bits out of what we've been doing in the last 3-year plan. There'll be a new three-year planning coming at the end of the year, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. So we've been working very hard on the whole issue of concentrated land ownership, or what I think it's actually better described as the local monopolies of landed power. I think that's the central issue. It's that monopoly over power, which means that if you want to rent a farm or a croft in that area, there's one person making the decisions. If you want to do X, Y, or Z, there's one person making decisions. If decisions over whether trees get planted or whatever, they're all down to one person in the area. It's a monopoly, it's a localized monopoly. And there was a manifesto commitment to address that issue. We've been working very hard to advise on how that might happen. There's been a consultation called the Land Reform in the Net Zero Nation earlier in the year. The results of that consultation have just been published. Please have a look at it if you are at all interested. It's very telling. 75% of those responded were extremely keen to see more regulation, more controls on that power. Very important. And part of it is this very important idea, which is not new, which is actually, would be seen as normal in France, for example, that when a piece of land is transferred, a large piece of land is transferred, sold, inherited, gifted, whatever, that there should be a public interest test to assess, is it actually wise in a democracy for that piece of land to be held by one person? Or in other words, should we be breaking up that monopoly if there is a monopoly? Now we do this in every other sector. You can't own all the banks, you can't own all the supermarkets, you can't own all the shops on Portree High Street, although you might well want to. The hotel industry, everything else. We control monopolies already in this country, but we do not have at the moment the kind of legislation that we've suggested. So that will come. There will be a land reform bill towards the end of the year. That will then go through Parliament in all the usual ways. You'll be able to contribute. And I think it will be quite a big step forward. It won't be the last word. Absolutely will not be the last word on land reform, in my view, but it will be a big step forward. Community ownership continues to be a big priority of this government, and I think of the Scottish people. Actually, there's a lot of support for it, and more generally, there's a lot of support for this idea that local communities should be more empowered. That rather than sit there and have things done to them, they should be much more empowered. So the idea of ownership has been developing for a while. There's been the land fund, there's been crowdfunding. I've mentioned the Western Isles. It's all sorts of things. There is legislation in place giving the community a right to buy in extreme circumstances, but there is a constraint in there that the European Convention on Human Rights requires governments to demonstrate a public interest case before forcing someone to sell up. Lauren's chairing a leadership group to take all of this forward, so we can talk about that if you wish. But it's certainly, I think, an important part of the next few decades in Scotland will be a growing awakening in rural and urban Scotland of communities who simply want to make their own decisions about things and not have everything done to them. And we saw that just the other day when we're all down in Dumfries and Galloway. There's an investor from London buying up lots of land, planting lots of trees. So what's the community's voice in that equation? Very important. Karen, among lots of things actually, but Karen is absolutely key in our good practice program. We've been publishing quite a range of good practice protocols or guidance, whatever you want, toolkit, whatever, because people say to us, and to be fair, a lot of landowners say, okay, I accept that with land rights go responsibilities, but what are my responsibilities? So we took the view, well, fine, we'll spell it out for you, mate. So we've set about spelling out what does responsible look like, and Karen's done it extremely ably, and she'll be able to speak further about it later. Doesn't have any legal basis at the moment, although in relation to tenant farming, interestingly, it does. But one of the things in consultation on the Land Reform Bill for later this year was, should there be a legal basis for these protocols? Should they be more than just a please kind of doff your cap and please would you do it kind of thing? So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Interesting to know what you think. Tenant Farming Commission, I'm not going to say much about this because it doesn't apply a great deal in Skye and West Ross, but it's important. It's important because I think what it tells us we could do in relation to other things. Tenant Farming Commissioner was created in 2016. It was an idea that came from a wee group I chaired on tenant farming at a time when landowners and tenants were at daggers drawn. Relations were appalling. And she or he, and at the moment it's a he, but I hope it'll be a she in due course, sets out codes of practice. They have a legal basis. She or he also has powers to bring in mediators. As it happens, the current one is also putting a lot of effort into new entrants, but it's mainly at the moment just about tenant farming. And the question must be, I think, should we take some of the learning from that and apply it to other things? I've mentioned the carbon thing, but I'm just going to say a wee bit more. So land prices right across Scotland are rocketing, absolutely rocketing. It's extraordinary. And particularly land prices where you could plant trees or sequester carbon in a bog, or potentially earn what are called biodiversity credits, though they don't exist at the moment and no one quite knows what they look like. A lot of that investment is speculative, and there may be a bubble, it may burst. But there's no question that at the moment there are significant risks to local communities in that bubble. There may be risks to jobs, there may be risks in terms of disempowerment. So we've been giving some pretty clear and strong advice to government and to investors, because government has said there will be a just transition to net zero. Well, if that's the case, we need to be very clear that just wading in here from London with a heap of money and buying up lots of land to earn carbon credits, the revenue from which trickles straight back to London, is not a just transition. And so we may or may not want to talk further about this evening. Vacant and derelict land, I mentioned, it is a major urban issue, but just in case you thought it's only an urban issue, on the vacant and derelict land register, I had a very quick look. I just picked 4 that are from the area we're covering tonight, just so you can see that this is not just about urban Scotland, but it is a particular blight in West Central Scotland, urban Scotland. Housing, we've published some pretty strong advice actually on housing, and I think we'll need to continue on this, because there is no question that the current speculative model that we have in Scotland, where people are pretty much free to buy land and then bring it forward for housing as and when they wish, is not delivering the public interest. In fact, what it's delivered over the last 30 or 40 years is an extraordinary rise in house prices, way ahead of inflation, which cannot be in the public interest. So we've set out a number of reforms. We're happy to talk further about that if you want. Quite a lot of it's urban focus, because there's colossal housing issues in urban Scotland. But of course, you know, all of us who live in rural Scotland, and particularly if you've got children in their 20s, as I have, know just how appallingly difficult it is for these kids to get a home. So it's a big issue. Tax, we've made some recommendations on tax, not a lot. I think the new government, with the new First Minister in Edinburgh, is minded to have another look at tax. And if that is so, we may find ourselves doing some more work on this. But at the moment, we recommended very clearly that there is a lot of value in land. It's not taxed at all heavily at the moment. It could be taxed. And tax could be used as a lever to support land reform objectives. People tend to think about tax as a way of government raising money. Actually, I think it's possibly more important as a lever to influence behaviour and ensure that landowners behave responsibly. So, one of the things I want to hear from you, please, is what do you think should be in the next strategic plan, the next 3 years? We have got to put something to the Minister and to Parliament by the end of September, I think it is. So we've got our work cut out. We've done some thinking. I'm happy to share that with you if you want, but if Megan will allow that. But I'm really more interested in what you think should be in that plan. You know, we've got finite capacity, but a dozen or so folk, a modest budget. We're determined to punch way over our weight. So we need to focus on the priorities that matter to you. We are, I think, also beginning to have wider influence in the UK, and I'm really pleased about that. The first thing that happened was that one of our staff actually was poached to go and be part of the Land Commission for think it was Birmingham or somewhere down in that part of the world. And then just recently, the House of Lords produced a report in which they pinched the title from our first strategic plan and applied it to their report. So we're obviously, somebody's watching what's going on, which is very encouraging. And I don't think we should be surprised. Scotland is a leading country. We've got great thinkers, great people, and we have, in some ways, you look at land and you think, good grief, massive estates, hugely concentrated pockets of power around the place, how archaic. And then you look at some of the things some of the other things we do, and you think, my goodness, what an extraordinary progressive country. I've just come back from visiting my daughter in the Netherlands, where I actually think we're pretty progressive on some of our access rights, for example. So lots to be proud of, and we'll continue to extend that influence. I do just lastly want to say, apart from thank you for coming, is there's a wealth of information on our website, so please have a look at it. Also, it's really good to talk to people. So if you want to talk to us, please email us and one of us will give you a ring back, because I think, sometimes, and especially post-COVID, when we've become more isolated, it's just really good to talk. So if you want to have a belly with any of us, drop us an email and we'll phone you back. Megan, thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a pretty fantastic run through of a lot of the work that we're doing. So, I mean, it's very clear land reform is an ongoing process. It can't ever be achieved with a single piece of legislation. And although we have achieved significant steps since we were established in 2017, there's still a lot more to do. And this evening's meeting is a really important opportunity for you all to shape the next 3 years of our work in terms of this new strategic plan that we're in the middle of developing. So I can see we've got some hands up already. We've also got some questions in the chat. So if we're going to start with the questions in the chat, there was a couple of questions from Rob Ware. Rob, if you don't mind, I'll just read them out. The first question was in relation to land ownership through charitable trusts. And then the second question was in relation to sort of landowner engagement with communities. Where is it in terms of in terms of what's happening on the ground in the Highlands? So maybe, Lauren, if I could hand over to you to talk a little bit about the charitable trust guidance and some of the other things we're thinking about in terms of charitable trusts and accountability and community engagement. And then Karen, maybe after that, if you could say a little bit about the land rights and responsibilities statement and principles applying to all types of landowners, and particularly your experience of sort of where we are in terms of landowners in the Highlands. Maybe if you've got anything particular in relation to charitable trusts and their engagement with local communities, that would be great. So Lauren, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Megan. And thanks, Rob, for the couple of questions there. Maybe one of my colleagues will actually put up on the chat box a link to the charities protocol. I think what we would expect a higher level of engagement and a higher level of openness and transparency in relation to charities. We also have a requirement within our protocol that charities consider appointing a locally based charitable trustee. So, I know what we're talking maybe about the Slate Peninsula and the Clandonald Lands Trust. Traditionally, historically, many of the trustees not particularly resident in Slate. But as was explained in the presentation, our protocols are not underpinned at the moment by legislation. So this is not a requirement in law. This is just best practice. But nevertheless, on the back of the new land reform bill, there could be a legal underpinning to these requirements. There are also people, we've had feedback in the past regarding, and in addition to Clandonald Lands Trust, there are obviously other large landowners that are charitable trustees. I know we've got representatives tonight from Applecross. Also, Mount Stewart and Butte is a charitable landowner, Blair Charitable Trust in Blair Athol. And there has been some discussion from feedback from various meetings we've had that in anticipation of the next Charities Act, there should be a democratization of charities. in terms of relationship to land. So that debate may progress over time. Going to your second part of your question about engagement, some of us were in Sleat recently at Salmarostig for the Community Land Scotland conference. And certainly when I was up there, I was picking up various talk about perhaps the level of engagement locally from the Clandonald Lands Trust perhaps wasn't as good as it should be and maybe historically has been. So if there is a particular issue there, please feel free to write to us and we can follow that up in terms of the good practice team, because really any landowner in the modern day age should be regularly engaging with communities and providing up-to-date information regarding their activities. So I'll just maybe leave it at that and pass to Karen.
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, in relation to the question of how good is landowner engagement with communities, is it getting better across the Highlands or standing still? It's a good question, and in the good practice team, our work pivots around the land rights and responsibilities statement, and engagement is absolutely central to that, because it's the point where opportunities around land can happen, and also negative impacts of land use decisions can be prevented if engagement is good. We work with a wide range of landowners, with all kinds of landowners really, which could be public sector, private sector, or community landowners, and it could be, you know, it could be utility companies, or it could be charitable trusts. But in the end, the same principles apply to all of them, and it's transparency of information is really important, and accessibility to the local community as well as community of interest. Is it getting better? I would say I feel reason for optimism, but the answer is it varies a lot, and some landowners are very, very good. Some of them know they've got a way to go, and they want to move in the right direction. And of course, you get the ones that are at the opposite end of the spectrum, and those are the ones that we sometimes hear about through our casework. Maybe if somebody makes a complaint, or if there's a problem. And so the good practice team is responsive in that way as well. In terms of helping landowners improve their practice, we have programs like a program called Leadership in Good Practice, where we we do training with the landowners and managers to help them understand their responsibilities and help them work towards actions that can improve what they're doing, and also help them share stories of what they are already doing. Obviously, the folk that sign up for something like that are the people who are already interested in developing good practice, but we feel it's very important to work with people like that, because then they go out and they influence their peers' approach to land management too.
Thanks, Karen. That's great. So I can see a couple of people with their hands up. Donald, I think you were first, and then we'll get to Chrissy in your tropical hammock on Raasay. On you go, Donald.
Oh, thanks, Megan. Yeah, and thanks to Andrew for that very comprehensive presentation on your work. Up in this corner of Skye, our land is in process of being sold from under our feet, and I know that there are ways and means that the community could possibly have purchased that land, but I mean, we've not had any time basically to have pulled together. And I don't think the community capacity is there anyway. So by far the largest crofting landlord in Skye, of course, is the Scottish Government. and what really is to stop the Scottish government doing something radical and purchasing this estate, not just for the crofters and the non-crofters that live here now, but that it's got the capacity to offer land, homes, and jobs to 5, 6 families with the land that there is. So I don't know if you as a commissioner are able to influence the Scottish government to actually do something radical. I mean, 100 years or more than 100 years ago, we had the British government did something fairly radical around land, where they had the Congested Districts Board that acquired estates to resettle people, and it was the anniversary of that, of course, was just now down at Portmalong and that part of Skye where there was people from Harris and Lewis were resettled. And I mean, we're in a position of social, economic, and environmental deprivation, which could well be addressed by precisely this kind of radical action, if you were in a position to persuade the Scottish government to do so.
Thanks, Donald. Before I hand this maybe over to Andrew to start with, in terms of a response, can you just say where you're from in Skye in terms of the land?
It's the Husebost estate,
right? Yeah,
in the northwest of Skye, and it's currently on the market.
That's right. Okay, okay. I've seen that in the media. I mean, we are aware of, this is a good example of a number of different challenges facing community groups who may be interested in, who are being caught out by rapid changes in the land market, estates coming onto the market without much prior notification and not being ready, either in a sort of organizational way or in terms of having the finances ready to be able to seriously consider putting in a bid to buy the land, and the current restrictions in place in terms of how the various different rights to buy. This is a good example of the way in which the existing right to buy routes are not providing the kind of support that communities need who are facing this kind of situation. And we hear, frustratingly, we hear examples of this on almost all of the public meetings, and we have been doing quite a lot of thinking about the ways in which these challenges can be overcome, some of which are to do with changes in legislation, some of which are to do with leadership being taken by particular public bodies who are owning land, and some of which are to do with some more radical thinking and projects that we are involved with. So Andrew, do you want to maybe give a quick run through on some of that in terms of the detail?
Can I just make 4 points, Donald? The first is this. So we're an advisor. We don't persuade or harass or lobby government to do anything. That's for voters. It's up to voters to persuade government to be radical. You're a voter, go for it. That would be my first point. I think it's really important. Voters need to be clear what they want and they need to articulate it. My second point is this. Government is actually through, for example, the Crown Estate Initiative, where Crown Estate has said it will set out to buy land and then transfer it to the community, but also through the Scottish Land Fund, which is being increased to 20 million a year, a lot of money. Scottish Government is buying land and transferring it to communities by those routes. At the same time, the Scottish Government is juggling with the fact that there are lots and lots of taxpayers and voters in Scotland who would rather they fixed the school or the roads or the hospitals than went off and bought land for communities. So it's not an easy one for governments. And I think we have to be realistic about this. The Scottish Government doesn't have a huge amount of financial control here, borrowing powers or anything else. My third point, I think, sorry, but my fourth point is the most important one. I simply don't buy this idea that communities don't have the capacity to do this. We've seen it all over Scotland, extraordinary examples of very small communities doing quite extraordinary things against, and you know, like Lorne and I are the two sort of old ancient so-and-sos here. And we both, well, sorry, I am, you're not, Lorne, but but my point is that we were here in the 90s. I was sat there in the pub with the Aston Crofters plotting the buyout there. Lorne was doing the same in Skye at that time. And loads and loads of naysayers say, oh, they'll never do it. They'll go belly up. They'll never raise the money, you know, and the landowners are sort of laughing into their gin and tonics. And goodness me, look what's happened. 75% of people in the Western Isles on community land. People all over Scotland doing all sorts of extraordinary things. So I do not buy this idea that we can't, that communities can't do it. What we suffer from in Scotland is a lack of self-confidence that is in part a consequence of the monopoly pattern of land ownership, and we need to fight back against that.
Yeah, I'm suitably chastened by. Oh, I'm still muted, am I? No,
no,
I'm
we can hear you.
chastened by that, Andrew. If I was 20 years younger, I would I'd be happy to lead a community bid, but you know, I've tried and without success so far. But we're limited by time. The thing's just slipping away from under our feet, and literally, and it also in the estate agents' particulars, it promotes the natural capital and the ability to cash in on that. So we got a fight in our hands whichever way.
Yeah.
Megan, can I just have a very quick comeback? Donald, so forgive me, I wasn't having a go at anybody there. I was just, and I absolutely do.
It's okay.
No, I absolutely get this is very, very difficult stuff, and it's getting more difficult because prices are rocketing and timescales are short, and the community right to buy legislation is far from perfect, and Lorne can tell you more about that. So, you know, it's an imperfect world. The point I really want to get over is, you know, I'm damned if I'll give up, and I really would encourage other people to think in those terms. We've achieved quite an extraordinary amount of stuff in 25, 30 years that I could not, you know, sitting there in the early 90s up in Caithness and Sutherland where I was working, talking about community buyouts and people laughing at us. And you look where we are now. Where are we going to be in 25 years from now? You know, it will be transformational again.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. And I think also just, I mean, it may be too late for your particular situation, Donald, but because of this this issue of communities in a number of places in Scotland being caught out by these rapid timeframes, and the fact that they're really struggling to raise the capital and get organised in terms of the governance structures required to take on ownership of land, we have worked with Crown Estate Scotland and just launched a new pilot project, and Nikki has just put the link to that in the chat. And this is a pilot project which is exploring the leadership role that a key public landowner can play in helping to step in situations where a piece of land is being transferred, but the community is not able immediately to take on the ownership of that land, and explore the role that a public body can play as an intermediary in those situations. So that's, I think, a really interesting pilot to watch, and it's really great to work with Crown Estate Scotland as a public body who clearly understands these issues and is interested in exploring and demonstrating that public bodies can play a really key role in these situations to help get a better balance between communities' aspirations for a particular piece of land and the fact that the market is evolving so rapidly in these situations. So, Chrissy, I think you're next, and then we'll come to you, Lucy. Thank you.
Hi there. My point was kind of just, it's kind of continuing on the challenges we're having in Raasay at the moment. We've got significant economic development happening on the island. We've got the distillery, we've got Raasay House, you've got the community shop, we've got our lovely, lovely hybrid ferry as well. But our biggest challenge at the moment is the fact that we cannot get the access to the houses on the island or access to the land that the Scottish Government owns to be able to get houses built quickly enough. Now, we've got 5 houses being built through Raasay Development Trust at the moment, and that took an absolute battle from 2014, 2015, I think it was, when they did the survey, to finally convince folk on the board that actually we were needing houses here. Now, I know of at least 4 families that have been turned away because there's not the housing on the island for them. Now, is there a way, and I don't know if this pilot project might be able to help with that, is there a way to set up some sort of pilot project with Scottish Government so that we can be getting access to the land in the same radical way that the crofts were set up 100 years ago here in Raasay following the land raids?
Well, there's a challenge. Lauren, I know that you were in Raasay not that long ago, so maybe, and I know that you did actually have some conversations with folk there about what's going on in terms of the fact that Raasay is a really good example. It's a vibrant community. There's so much going on. The Development Trust has done an amazing job of creating jobs and economic opportunities. As you said, Chrissy, there's so many things going on. The island is almost entirely owned by 2 different public bodies, and yet there's still these challenges in terms of accessing land for housing, for crofts, and for other community aspirations. So maybe, Lauren, if you could say something, and then Andrew, I saw you put your hand up if you want to add on to that as well after. Thank you.
Yeah, a very important point, Chrissy, and I think, first of all, it has to be said, this is a really, really positive situation on Raasay in terms of the number of young people and the amount of economic development and number of young people that want to stay on the island. So that's the positive. The negative is obviously getting the housing, and it's great to see the 5 new units being developed at the back of Inverarish. But there is a major point there in terms of public ownership. And this is maybe also going back to Donald Murdy's point earlier there, because obviously maybe not just addressing the Raasay point, but, the Kilmuir, Scripida estate, the estate in Mingonish as well. The minister, our minister, Mary Goujon, is very keen that public bodies take a lead in a lot of what is happening. And at the Salmarostig Community Land Scotland conference, made a point of that in her video address. So I think we can develop something innovative that hopefully will address a situation such as Raasay. And funnily enough, Chrissy, in anticipation of this meeting this evening, I was in touch with Hamish Trench, our chief executive, just about possibilities of, for instance, woodland croft creation on Forestry and Land Scotland estates, various perhaps pilot initiatives that could be considered or could be developed. Obviously, the public bodies would only be keen to do that if they got a community mandate. So it's very important. Raasay Development Trust is pivotal on that. So, it would be good to keep a kind of communication link with you and others on that, Chrissy, because that's a very, very important point you make. So I think we'll just keep in touch with you on that one, because that's a specific I wouldn't mind taking further forward. So I'll just do you a wee line on the direct chat, but I'll pass back to Megan at this stage.
Thanks, Lauren, and that would be great if you could take that up with Chrissy and other folk there directly. Andrew, I think you wanted to come in on this as well.
Well, just briefly, because the question from Chrissy was absolutely valid. Is there a way? Well, absolutely there's a way. There's more than one way, actually. The first simple way is that the Scottish Minister can sell land to a community organisation of some sort, and the community can fundraise, including from the Scottish Land Fund. So that's the first way. The second way is through the asset transfer process. Again, you could apply for an asset transfer. I'm not sure, I don't know enough about this, Chris, so forgive me, but I just wonder whether it's more complicated than you're maybe saying, are there planning problems? Are there crofting tenure problems? Because the simple question of, can the community acquire a piece of land in order to build some affordable housing? The answer to that is yes, no question.
Well, this is part of the challenge. We do know of certain areas. I mean, there's been some grand discussions about re-peopling over in Hallig and Scrapital, which I think are absolutely fantastic ideas. But then there's the question of, well, how long does it take? And it's finding builders to actually be able to do the work as well is part of our challenge, and getting folk over here. So I am involved in RDT, and we will continue the battles.
Well, that's fine. It's just, I guess your response has confirmed what I felt, which was this is not just an issue about land. It's more, people, I often get at public meetings, especially in the Highlands, oh, well, if only the landowner would release the land, we'd all have lots of houses. It's not as straightforward as that. But the straightforward question that you asked is, can Scottish ministers get transfer land to communities? Absolutely no question. And if there's any blockage to that, then frankly, you need to get in there with size 11 boots.
Thanks, Andrew. And maybe just I should share some of my own personal experience, because another job I have is the local development manager with the Applecross Community Company, and we have land for affordable housing. What we're being challenged by is getting all the other ducks in the row in terms of the finance and the planning and contractors and everything. So it is a very heavy lift for a community development organisation, particularly one which is managed by volunteer directors and maybe has skeleton staff. I just want to, before we move on, Lucy, because I know you've had your hand up for a long time, I just also wanted to reflect back on so in Andrew's presentation, he talked about some very big studies that we've done looking at the role of land availability for housing. And one of the studies was a lot of the work we did looked at the role of large-scale developers down in more urban and peri-urban central belt areas. But Savills did a very interesting report for us, which is available on the website, that looked at the particular challenges for providing affordable housing in sparsely populated and rural areas. And they, funnily enough, and this isn't going to be a surprise to any of you, highlighted the fact that in these areas, Raasay, Applecross, Skye and west of us, we don't have large-scale housing developers operating. So whilst there are challenges in terms of the availability of land, there are other challenges in terms of the fact that the burden for building and providing housing is falling on local community groups, and there need to be much greater support through the planning system. And the report makes a number of recommendations about what could make it easier for community groups to be acquiring land and then getting everything else ready in order to be able to provide housing and ultimately tackle development objectives of the community around repopulation and making sure that the population is viable and that there are economic opportunities that people can take forward. So I think Nikki has just shared the link to that, or was it Karen? Thank you very much. But I'm now going to move over to Lucy, I think, who's next in the list. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I just had a question about the whole carbon credit scheme. It makes me quite nervous, and I'm come from near Ullapool, and I've got some land where I have planted trees in the past, and I've just sort of not taken the offer of carbon credits because I'm very uncommercially minded, and I'm kind of, I'd want to know where they were going, and I'd want to know that it was doing good in my area. I wouldn't want to be selling it to EasyJet or something like that, And there's been a bit of discussion amongst the farming community, fellow farmers and Wester Ross and Easter Ross as well. If folks were to create a carbon credit, they'd like to almost, give it back, say, to a dairy farm or something like that, that would kind of equal it out. So I wondered, a wee bit like you have the British Wool Marketing Board, although I'd rather have a Scottish one, I have to say, a Scottish Wool Marketing Board. But if there could be some kind of study to kind of see how a cooperative structure or maybe a credit union would work for the carbon credits, because that would almost stop people, when estate agents are advertising something and saying, oh, this has great carbon credit potential as an investment, that would take that out of the equation, because then we'd have a level playing field and folks wouldn't be bandying about carbon credits to the person who's got the highest amount of money. So yeah, I'm just feeling a bit lost in the whole process, and I certainly don't want to sell any to any unscrupulous people.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks for being honest about being lost. And to be honest, I think that's the general sense that a lot of people have about the rapidness with which all of this is evolving. And we've got wooden carbon code, we've got the peatland carbon code. People are talking about biodiversity codes and other kinds of codes, and the plethora of which the fastness through which this is all happening. And it is extremely confusing and complicated for anyone to keep track of. I think, just to say from the Land Commission's perspective, this is on the edge of our remit. So we have made recommendations as part of the wider natural capital research and analysis that we've published, highlighting some concerns we have around the need for greater regulation of the carbon markets. But it's not something which sort of falls squarely within our remit. It's also something which is governed both at the UK level and at the Scottish level. And then the Woodland Carbon Code, for example, actually seems to be kind of entirely out with government regulations in terms of it being an independent certification scheme. So we are aware of these issues, and it is what you have said in terms of the hesitancy around getting involved as a landowner, as someone who could potentially register carbon credits, is also something that we've heard before. But there is some good news in terms of the fact that I think there's a lot of different groups who are trying to help provide guidance and advice and provide clarity really on what the options are, where the pitfalls are, and how to avoid them. There is some advice in the work that we have published, as I said already, and we will be publishing some more guidance around community benefit sharing later on in the summer. Community Land Scotland have also provided recently published advice for their members around how, as landowners, community landowners can think about engaging with carbon markets. I also know, again, from recent workshops, that HIE is also considering doing a lot of scaling up their advisory role in this area. So Sandra Holmes is someone you might want to speak to. Karen, do you want to say a little bit about some of the community benefit sharing sort of thinking we've been developing around making sure communities and local groups can access and can get a fairer share of the benefits which are coming out of from these carbon markets? And then Andrew, I don't know after that if you want to say anything about some of the engagement we've been having around the Scottish Government's investment principles around the natural capital sector more generally. Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, so I've not been working directly on this community benefit work, so others might want to add to what I say, but so you're, Lucy, you're coming at it as a sort of small scale land manager yourself. In the Commission, a lot of what we've been working on in relation to community benefit is looking at the influence on the land market of investors that are wanting to buy land for natural capital purposes, and thinking how do we ensure this is something that's in some ways happening beyond, it's certainly beyond our control, and how do we but it is happening and there's this momentum there. How do we make sure it happens in a way where that kind of new source of income generation that's happening because of the carbon market or wider environmental services markets, how do we try to make sure that happens in as good a way as it can, given that it is happening and that some of that benefit and investment is filtered through to the communities that are directly impacted by those projects. And as Megan was saying, it's a very rapidly changing landscape, both literally and metaphorically. And so the Commission's thinking is also rapidly changing to try to keep up with that. And the conversation around community benefits is developing very quickly. And the way that it's evolving is also more relating to ideas around community wealth building, as well as the sort of more kind of windfall aspects. It's something like the funds that were created around renewables projects and that sort of thing. So there's different routes to community benefit, both. But I suppose the Commission's interest in that is that those routes lead to better community resilience and opportunities and well-being. Yeah, if anyone else wants to come in on that one, I've maybe not been very specific.
No, that's great, Karen, thank you. Andrew, do you want to add anything?
3 quick points, because I see Rob wants in. Let's be very careful when we talk about community benefit that we're not just talking about sweeties from the rich man's table. There's been a bit of a tendency to do that. You know, the wind farm guys gave us 5,000 a megawatt. It wasn't that terribly kind of them. They may have made 500,000 megawatt themselves, but we seem to forget that. I think we're increasingly trying to say, and Karen said it pretty eloquently already, actually, we're trying to say, look, community benefit is what communities decide is beneficial to them. You know, there isn't a definition. And to give you a quick illustration from Galloway, we stood in a field in Galloway with a guy from London investing millions in land in Galloway to plant up trees. And he was saying, well, yeah, you know, we could give the community a kind of lease on that wee bit because we don't want to plant trees on it anyway. And I'm afraid I left that meeting quite annoyed, actually, because it seemed to me that was the wrong way around. The question was, if you're going to come into this community's area, mate, and if you're going to plant a heap of trees, you do so on the community's terms, not on your terms. And we need to think about turning that around. And that, I think, to directly answer Megan's request, is I think the Scottish government is serious about this. It is serious about getting to a place where communities are properly empowered at the start of these discussions, so that people who come in to invest in natural capital in whatever form, for carbon capture, for whatever, in whatever form, they come in and they do so in partnership with and on the, if you like, on the terms of the local community. I think I don't have any doubt that that's the aspiration. Delivering it is the problem, not the aspiration. So let's just thirdly, briefly, let's talk about that. So we, as Karen has said, are working pretty fast and pretty hard at putting together some really clear, robust, and frankly rather blunt advice, which we expect people to follow. And I frankly hope that it does get some statutory underpinning at some point, so that, you know, it won't be optional. You know, frankly, you will not get forestry grant if you do not do X, Y, Z, and A, B, C. We need to get to that place, and we need to get there quickly. In the meantime, there will be carbon credits that are desirable, and there will be, if communities want to, communities can make carbon credits rather untidy. You know, you've already seen it. I'm not going to name the landowner, but you've already seen it where a particular company purchased land to plant trees, so if you bought one of their products, you would also plant a tree. And it quickly got to a point where the community was saying, well, actually, that's not quite what we want here. We're not happy about this. And all of a sudden, this great PR puff kind of started to blow up in their face. So communities have more power here than I think sometimes they realize. Please use that power.
Thanks, Andrew. And I suppose I should also say finally, before we move on to Rob's question, Lucy, that, you know, it's one thing to register a carbon credit. It's another thing to then sell it. And that's always the option, is just to register them at this stage and hold on to them for you to decide what you want to do in the future.
I think we just decided not to, but yeah.
No, I completely understand.
A tree planting scheme. Yeah. As a family, we had to plant the trees, you know, and it made it less affordable, but I just thought it was too much of a minefield.
Absolutely. No, and I may well have made the same decision as you, but in that situation. But I think it's this conversation about whether or not to register carbon credits has got bundled up with the kind of pros and cons of the wider carbon market, and they are actually two different stages, and they kind of need to be decoupled from each other in terms of how we think about it. Rob, over to you.
Thank you. Well, 2 points actually. One, a little bit of chat.
Sorry, Rob, it's very difficult to hear what you're saying. Could you hold your microphone a little bit closer?
I'll turn off my
That's much
headphones.
clearer. Thank you.
Is that better now?
Much better.
Hang on a second. One second. Just turn off my headphones.
We can't hear you now. We could hear you before you turned it off. We still can't hear you. No. Do you want to try writing your question in a chat, or do you want to try again now? Still can't hear you. Maybe while Robert, are you okay to write your question in the chat? Maybe while we wait for Rob, we had one question which came in from someone who wasn't able to attend this meeting, who is Shona McLennan, who's the Chief Executive of Bord na Gaelic, and she was someone that both Lauren and I had a conversation with at the Community Land Scotland conference. And her question, which she's asking of all public bodies at the moment, in relation to the connection with the promotion and protection of the Gaelic language and the Gaelic culture, and that relationship to land, given the fact that there's such a long-standing connection between Gaelic-speaking communities and land reform. And so her question really was to us was, what is it that we are doing to make sure that the Gaelic language is promoted and protected within our own Gaelic language plan? Now, we have a statutory duty to publish a Gaelic language plan, and maybe Nikki, you could locate that and put it into the chat link. But I wonder, Lauren, if there's anything you wanted to say, particularly in maybe talk about what we're doing to do that within our work and where that might go in the future. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Megan. And, you know, just following up on that, I know in writing our original Gaelic plan, we very much reflected probably also the masthead for the West Highland Free Press and Cheer and Canon Snadunya, the actual tie-in between the land, the language and the people. It's just, you know, traditional to the area that we are presenting to tonight, that the land is very much intrinsic to the communities and of such great importance there. So in developing our language plan, which we have progressed extremely well on, we see the importance of the language to the land in terms of the interpretation, the Gaelic names for land or various parts of the countryside. So it is most important in actually adding and improving your understanding of the land in Scotland to have knowledge and cognizance of the Gaelic associated with that. So I think, you know, in response to Shona McLennan's point there, very much Scottish Land Commission sees the importance of the Gaelic language, and it's very much integral. In fact, we are maybe one of the most unusual organisations in that the Land Reform Act 2016 that set up the Scottish Land Commission requires that one of the land commissioners is a Gaelic speaker. So we're actually going a lot further than many other public organisations. So I'll pass back to you, Megan, on that.
Thank you, Lauren. Rob, shall we try with you again? Or are you writing your... You're writing, okay, fine. Andrew or Karen, is there anything else you'd like to respond to in terms of the Gaelic language plan or other points we've had recently?
Well, Megan, not on the Gaelic language plan, because you've very ably answered that, but I think it would be remiss not to just say a little bit more about the whole natural capital thing, because it's so important, and Lucy's absolutely right. So we published, I think it was last week or week before, I can't forget it now, just a sort of a review. You know, we're publishing annually a review of what is happening in the land market, these extraordinary things. And that showed just quite remarkable soaring prices for some particular types of land, and some real odd things like you can, if your peat is now trashed and degraded, you'll get a higher price per acre for that than if it's good quality peatland, because people can then flog the credits off it as they fix it. So it showed some really odd things. I do think it's really important that, I mean, obviously people like Lucy are aware, and thanks Lucy for raising it, but lots of people aren't. People just don't know that this stuff's happening. But what is happening is that highly speculative money is being invested in land. Sometimes money that's being borrowed at quite high rates. So there is a very real risk of what they call an investment bubble, prices rising and rising very fast on the back of an excited possibility, and then bursting and land prices collapsing. And that's not necessarily a good thing for anybody, because if land prices suddenly collapse, that can seriously damage the businesses on which jobs and all the rest of it depend in rural Scotland. So all of this stuff is quite risky, and it's relevant to everybody's lives. And let me give you a real example without naming the organisation. There is an organisation buying, at the moment, quite large areas of land in Scotland, and has come from nowhere to own quite a big chunk. The bulk of its latest purchase will be funded through borrowing, a bridge loan. And that's very high risk, because the paying the interest on that loan and the servicing of that borrowing depends really on what amounts to a hope, a forecast, that the company will be able to then earn money by restoring the land in biodiversity terms and selling biodiversity credits, though biodiversity credits don't actually exist at the moment, and by selling carbon credits, as Lucy described. So it may be great. It may be great, and don't get me wrong, I'm not against investment in natural capital. It could produce lots of exciting, really interesting jobs for clever, highly trained people in Scotland. But for goodness sake, let's go at this with our eyes wide open and in a measured, informed manner. And let's not let it be done to us by, I speak as someone who lives, and my kids live in the Highlands. Let's not let it be done to us. Let's understand what's happening and engage vigorously in that debate.
Thank you, Andrew. I think that's such a good point. We're really seeing such dramatic changes in land ownership, changes in land use, and changes in land value taking place, particularly across certain parts of rural Scotland and in the Highlands. This is definitely one of the areas which is getting most impacted. So it is something that we are trying our hardest to best understand and make appropriate advice to the ministers and others about what should be done in order to make sure that we're still able to derive the best public good and benefit we can from our land, despite all these different competing demands. Now, I think we are still having some issues, Robert, and the message you said that you sent seems to have disappeared. Ah, no, here we are. Right, I now have Rob's message. Okay, so this is about the Scottish Government's commitment to onshore wind farms, but the fact that community benefits are not built in legally for wind farm projects. So taking point in Sandvik Trust and Lewis, which seems to be a gold standard in terms of the per annum per megawatt, but the average seems to be around only 5,000 to 7,000 per annum per megawatt. And what can communities do to ensure that they are able to negotiate community benefit for their own areas? It's interesting. Andrew has just been talking about the visit we had to Galloway last month, and one of the evident problems down there was that there were individual afforestation and forest restocking projects being allocated across a vast area without really any understanding of the cumulative impact of what all of those trees would mean for watersheds, for landscapes, for the missed opportunities, what else you might do with the land if it's dedicated to trees, what would happen if you took arable and farmland out of the arable sector and put it towards forestry. And one of the things that we've been really trying to grapple with was sort of who should be stepping forward in terms of having that kind of long-term view and oversight in terms of the cumulative impact. And I understand from some of the discussions about wind farm developments in progress in Skye, that there are similar concerns about some of those cumulative impact. And I suppose that's part really of your question, Rob, maybe in terms of how, not just how communities can best benefit from privately owned wind farms, but also what the cumulative impacts are from all of these projects. I don't know if there's anyone on the call who's been involved, because I know there's been a number of public meetings being held on Skye in relation to this. Is anyone there? Is anyone on the call being involved in those meetings? Or Lauren, I saw you putting your hand up if you want to say anything.
Thanks, Megan. I wasn't involved in the meetings, but I'm kind of aware of them, obviously, of proposals going forward. Now, you know, Rob makes a very good point. The kind of £5,000 standard per megawatt installed is pretty paltry compared to the kind of money that is being made by wind turbines. Bringing all that back to land, obviously ourselves as a land commission, but you talk about Point and Sandwick, and I was also involved with Storrs Uish, South Uist Estate, who have got 3 2.3 megawatt turbines on their land at Loch Carnan. Now, again, the principle of that is that there's community ownership of the land, so 100% of the benefits are coming back to the community. And the last I looked, it was some kind of like a net profit of about 700,000, 800,000 annually coming into the Storrs Uish, the South Uist Estate. So again, there is help out there in terms of Community Energy Scotland and others to support communities. And again, there is precedent elsewhere about where there are several turbines going up by a private developer that maybe a community owns 1 or 2 of them there. So I know it's been a debate in several meetings around Skye, particularly. It may also be of interest in wider Wester Ross. But I think it is certainly something that land brings greater benefits. I can't quote off the top of my head, I can't quite remember it, but I think Faye MacLeod of Campbell Stewart McLennan in Portree had done some kind of study and said that for the equivalent of the 5,000 per megawatt installed that is produced, you would almost need, 34 times turbines as compared to the benefit from a direct kind of installation that is totally owned by communities. So there is a wide difference there. So the point has been well made by Rob. Back to you, Megan.
Okay, Lauren, thank you. I'm aware that we're only 10 minutes before our end session. So is Martin, I was going to say, anyone who hasn't yet spoken, please, if you've got something to say, please put your hand up. So if there's anyone else who wants to say anything before we close, please put your hand up or put a question in the chat. And over to you, Martin. Sorry, Martin, you're still muted.
Can you hear me now? I'm just adding to the previous point, really, that these agreements for wind turbines, if they're going to be running for 25 years or so, it's incredibly important that the communities involved with these get the right deal. So we've really got to learn very quickly about this. Secondly, the capacities of the lines transmitting the electricity seem to be filled up very, very quickly by large projects, which is squeezing out the smaller renewable projects, which might be wholly community owned, which is concerning as well. And the third point is where the land is not owned by the community, who do the payments go to, and where does the benefit to the local community come there? Is it going into the landowner's community benefit pocket, which is used to help running the estate, or is there actually some tangible benefits to local people? That's all I needed to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I mean, I think you're flagging some of the key issues which are definitely needing to be bottomed out. Our core recommendation when it comes to any of these kind of projects is that we need to see greater community engagement from the very start of these projects, and that can often help to ensure that the communities get a chance to ask these kind of questions from the developers directly. Karen and Andrew and Lauren, is there anything any of you want to say before we finish? Andrew, please go ahead, and then Karen after you.
Well, I didn't want to cut in front of Karen. Karen, do you want to go first? No. So whole endorse on that. I mean, if the community owns the land, then they hold the cards in terms of getting benefit from any land use, including wind turbines. The point I wanted to make is a slightly different one. Is whether you get 5,000 a megawatt or whether you get 50,000 or 500,000 a megawatt, what matters is then what do you do with that money and how wisely do you look after it? And what I've seen, I was involved some years ago, well before this job, I was involved in trying to help Highland Council sort this out as some of them started to come on stream. And I'm afraid to some extent we've failed. And the reason is that a lot of communities have, the money's come in and it's been spent on all sorts of things, which in the short term have been quite valuable, but in the long term may almost become liabilities because they cost money to run. And crucially, what we haven't created is any sort of community wealth fund. We've created community income streams that get spent. And the analogy would be Norway and the UK with oil money. The UK used its revenue from oil to reduce taxation in the UK. So we spent it. Norway saved it up into a big sovereign wealth fund, and it now benefits from that. And I would really encourage us to think about the other half of this equation. It's not just how much money can we get, but how are we going to wisely use that money? Not so that it benefits us. Come on, guys. What about our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren? I don't want my great-great-grandchildren to look back and think, oh, that crusty old son, say, did a deal with SSE, got 10,000 a megawatt, and then pissed it against the wall. We don't want to be in that place.
We certainly don't. Andrew, Karen, over to you.
Well, it's actually in a way ties in a bit to what Andrew was just saying, because it's also connected with that issue of being kind of visionary about how you want your community to be, how you want your country to be, because Megan, you mentioned the question of sort of long-term view and oversight over the cumulative impacts of these kind of new developments, like whether it's renewables or natural capital land use changes driven by the carbon market or whatever. And it made me think, maybe I should mention another piece of work and advice that the Commission did in the past around regional land use partnerships. The idea is that with integrated land management decision making, where the views of different sectors and the considerations of competing land use needs are brought together through whatever planning process, the idea is that would result in better regional land use decision making. And as many of you will know, that there's a pilot process going on with 5 different regional land use partnerships who have been working over the past year and a bit, and they're to publish regional land use frameworks by the end of the year. Whether that exact shape of solution gets taken forward or whether it becomes something else is still a big question mark. But I think it's really important that communities and that everybody kind of engages with that question of how do we work towards better decision making that takes in these competing needs, so that we can work towards the kind of community and the kind of society that we want to live in.
Thanks, Karen. That's such an important point, and I think that we have these regional land use partnerships and regional land use frameworks and plans which are being developed, but we can also take that down to a much more local level in terms of what the national planning framework provides for in terms of giving greater focus to local place plans and community development plans. And that's also really exciting and tremendously important in terms of communities taking the leadership in terms of identifying what land they currently have or would like to have in the future for their development objectives. Lauren, before I wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add? No. Okay, well, in that case, we're almost at 8:30. So thank you very much for sticking with us. I'm getting attacked by midges coming in the window here. We really appreciate everyone coming and joining us this evening. I wanted to thank Lauren, Andrew and Karen, and also to thank Nikki for helping out behind the scenes. A few reminders. We'll be adding a survey link to the chat box if you wouldn't mind giving us some feedback following the meeting. As I mentioned at the beginning, myself, Andrew, and one of the other commissioners are stepping down in December. The Scottish Government will be recruiting for replacement appointed commissioners. You don't have to have experience working on a public body. You need to have a passion and understanding of land reform, and it's important. It's important in terms of the wider objectives that we're trying to achieve in Scotland. So if you know anyone that might be interested, if you're interested in yourself, please keep a lookout for that. It's a really important opportunity to shape the next period of the Land Commission's work. And I also wanted to thank you all for joining us and for giving us your views and asking us such critical questions. It's so important for our current thinking and also for the development of our next strategic plan that we are able to continue to have these kind of conversations. So we really appreciate everyone's views. Again, I just want to remind you before closing that it's so unfortunate that we're not able now to go off and have a cup of tea and a biscuit with you individually. So if you do have anything else you want to raise with us or things you felt that you couldn't say in a public forum but you'd like to raise privately, please get in contact via the contact information or just find us through social media as well. So other than that, I want to say thank you all, thank you everyone, and good night.
Cheers, Megan. Excellent.